Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start a couple of minutes early. I just see a few storm clouds in the distance, potentially, so I kind of want to get the show on the road before the rain comes. My name is Stephen Scholl. I am a researcher with the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, and I am extremely proud and honored to be moderating what I think will be an excellent panel on urbanism. It's an exciting topic, and I think there's going to hopefully be a lot of fun discussion, maybe a little debate about what urbanism should be, where's it's heading, and what can we do about it as people. I would like to first introduce our first panelist, Dr. Rebeka Vital. She is an experienced senior lecturer at the Shenkar School of Design, where she teaches degrees in interior, building and environment design, as well as leading innovative research in two main fields, lighting and cultural heritage. Dr. Vital heads her own lighting consulting firm with the principal work of lighting consulting in domestic, commercial, and public projects, both domestically in Israel and internationally as well. Thank you, Rebeka, for coming and joining us. Our second panelist will be Erik Bootsma. Erik Bootsma is an architect, urban planner, and author. He was educated at the Thomas Aquinas College and the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in ecclesiastical architecture and civic design. He has written for numerous periodicals and teaches sacred architecture at the Catholic Distance University. He lives in Richmond, Virginia, with his wife and 5 children. And finally, last but not least, we have Stephen Mouzon. He is an architect, urbanist, and author, blogger, and photographer based in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He co-founded the Urban Guild, which was instrumental in the creation of the Katrina Cottage initiatives. The Guild is a nexus of Project Smart Dwelling, which works to redefine the house to be so much smaller and more sustainable. So thank you all so much for joining us. I wanted to start this discussion with something that's a little bit basic, which is when we're talking about urbanism or urban planning, what should the metric of judging urban planning be? How can we decide, is this a good plan or is this a bad plan? What are the metrics that you yourselves look for when you're looking at an urban plan? And please, Stephen, we can start with you.
My top metric is actually happiness. Is it a place that raises people's spirits, or does it bring their spirits down? There is no more effective standard than that, quite frankly.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I would initially say that as well, that you have a place where human activity can happen in the way that it's intended to be, which is we're intended to be living in community. But I refer to the work that Strong Towns, an organization in the United States, does on urbanism. That they've done a lot of work actually in looking at how urban design affects the taxable income. Now, it may not be the same in different places that have different ways to tax, but certainly in the United States, we can look at the way that a city works. It's a traditional compact city, and that the amount of funding it takes to maintain that, as opposed to how much money it generates in taxable income or economy, we can look at that and we could say that what is in a downtown area, a dense urban environment, produces much more income than what we call sprawl, so the suburban car-oriented areas, so that the cost of the infrastructure outweighs the cost, the income that you're going to get. So it's a pretty easy one just on a metric. That's just that's just to really put bolster what we really want to do is just create places for human beings.
I would like. Hello. I would like to quote an architect, Danish architect and urbanist, Jan Gehl, who said that a good city is like a good party. You don't want to leave too early. You don't want to miss out. So maybe that's a good starting point to start looking at our cities. And of course, the dwellers' well-being is taking the primary position in the understanding whether a city is successful or not. And there are other indicators like economic growth. Do commercial places succeed in the city? Do tourists want to come and visit? And of course, sustainability. Is the city helping to have a more sustainable tomorrow, or is it not? And also that's what defines a resilient city, which means if it can adapt, if it can change to all the challenges and uncertainties that the future might have.
Great, thank you. One of you, of course, mentioned this idea of compact cities. And of course, what I think that largely refers to, when we look at the history of cities, especially European cities, right, they seem to have been fairly compact up until around 100 years ago or so, the turn of World War II. And when we compare, for example, city planning, from before World War II to city plannings after, it seems like a completely different mindset came in. Here in Hungary, one of the towns they took me to when I first arrived was Saugatoryan, which is like this very well-known, entirely communist plan design place. It's very beautiful. But I noticed that even besides these block houses, right, the planning of the city itself was so different from the traditional Hungarian town. So I want to ask you guys, what happened to this urban planning? Why did it change so radically in the last 100 years? Is this purely the result of, well, we can hear it, the car, or is there something ideological that changed, something of the mindset where they valued things differently than what came before?
Yeah, it was actually both, and quite frankly, if you look back in the really it kind of began in the 1920s, but really it flourished more in the 30s. There were all these just totally seductive illustrations of the future city by a lot of the people that considered themselves futurists, and it was. And cars were zooming everywhere. It was everything was towers and expressways, and that was considered to be the ideal that we should be pursuing. And even people, John Nolan was a planner that was very famous in the 1920s for doing a number of great new towns, but even Nolan said, I think that in one of his later books, he said, this idea of single-use districts actually is the future. And of course, that was the beginning of sprawl. You have one district for housing, another district for, it's a shopping district, and another one that's an office park. So even what I would consider the good guys were, and I say guys advisedly because at that time it was a male-dominated profession, but anyhow, I consider even a lot of the good guys they fell under the sway of these enormously seductive drawings.
When I look at the last century, I think we can divide this change that you, Stephen, are talking about, in maybe 3 time periods, I would say. It was the early 20th century, and there we have the technological advancements, the car, and also the change in mass transportation. Suddenly we have mass transportation, so all the people don't need to be in the center of the city, and the city starts sprawling out. Cities already exist for several centuries. They start decaying. We have new concepts of urban renewal that start with Le Corbusier and the idea of towers in the park, which talks about building into height skyscrapers and making the footprint smaller so that we have more green areas around it and renewing the city like that. So this is what's happening in the early 20th century. We actually have a good example which was never realized, the Ville Contemporaine in 1923, if I'm not mistaken, of Le Corbusier, which shows these ideas of the future of the city. And then we have the middle of the 20th century, and we have some other phenomena. We see the start of this new urban renewal, and we see the suburbia becoming more popular. People are escaping from the city centers for their housing, and then only work is left and commercial in the center of the city. And now that brings us at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of our century, that we have other issues. We have issues of sustainability, climate change, and also information technologies that come and change the perspective on how our cities should be. Information technologies today, they are incorporated into the infrastructure of the city, and we're aiming for smart cities, for cities that are dynamic and adaptive.
The roots of what happened in the 20th century really kind of go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and really kind of what the thinkers at the time, and particularly I think Marx, and how he looked at industry and how the relationship of work and the workers was. And so, and basically, and even going back to Hegel, really, that the nature of the world had changed because of the Industrial Revolution. So the nature of the world had changed, and therefore the nature of man had changed. And so to correspond to that, architecture and planning and cities had to correspond to that changed nature. So you read Corbusier, and he talks about the new industrial man. And this is, of course, this is Marx's new man. This is the Hegel's new man that we're creating. So to have a city that was corresponding to that, and he would respond to it. The new industrial man will respond to this new industrial architecture, this new industrial way of living. So we would strip out everything that was useless, and so everything would be gone from it, and we would replace it with machines for living. These would be the place where you would just simply be able to be a worker in this cog of this new industrial society that we had. Cars, of course, were a key part to that, because they're symbolic, too, of that industrial change and that massive change. And so the car would allow you to do all of those things, to separate out the use, so that you have machines for living, and you had machines for building, and you had machines for all of these other things. And so it was to see that the nature of everything, the nature of humanity had changed. And so because of that, everything had to change. Everything had to be revolutionized. And so throughout all of this. And so then, like you said, I think it's great that you kind of divide out all the different ages. And what happened is, after World War II, especially in the United States, the aesthetic of these things, the planning of these things, and the American obsession with the car, which really kind of began even before World War II, they became obsessed with this. It became brought on. Now, of course, a lot of the philosophy didn't necessarily come with it, because we were very capitalistic and all of that. But all of the aesthetics and all the planning came with it without any sort of understanding of what was behind it. But then, the United States has just basically continued all of that. So,
one very quick note: we heard earlier about the tower in the park. The reality in too much of the U.S. is that it's actually the tower in the parking lot, not the park.
When I think of suburbanization, I think a lot of people think in particular of the United States, right? If I were to Google American house, I would probably get the very typical acre lot house on a road, no sidewalk, but just on a road surrounded by entire house after house after house. I'd be curious if it's similar in Israel, since Israel is, of course, since its refounding 70 years ago, I think developed in the same period where the U.S. also experienced a lot of growth. So I'd be curious to see how suburbanization had come to Israel, or if it had or hadn't. But what do you guys see as some of the side effects of this? So we've identified there's a big change in how cities are planned. What do you see are some of the main side effects? Both on, and maybe actually I'm mostly talking about on a personal level. How has this affected how people live their lives? Has it resulted in some good things, some good changes, or has it resulted in bad changes in the average person's life?
I have a pretty striking story in this regard. And I grew up in a sprawling place and lived there for most of my life until what was I, 43, I guess it was, when we moved from Huntsville, Alabama to South Beach. At the time that we moved, I was morbidly obese. I probably would not be even alive today. But when you live on South Beach, you get 10,000 steps a day just by living life. You know, go to the grocery, you know, go to, you know, just the activities of daily life. You know, and I lost like 60 pounds. But this is the story of living in sprawl versus living in urbanism. It literally affects your life in very fundamentally different ways that either will make you healthier and happier, or will make you very unhappy and maybe die quickly.
My upbringing sort of in urbanism, my sort of path to get into urbanism was sort of delayed for a long time to get into architecture. But I think the seeds to my understanding of architecture and urbanism really came from the town that I lived in. Was actually very typical for what was in the United States, which is actually very close to what the model in Europe is. It's that towns were compact, they were walkable, and they were usually connected by trains. And most of the American West, I grew up in Oregon, was entirely built in the 19th century and the 20th century around train stations. And so every single town that you go out there has where the train station was, and everything grew up around it. But growing up in that town, I never really thought about any other way of life. Our town never really had any massive changes other than, you know, you really didn't take the train everywhere. But I could walk as a kid. I could walk to every corner of town. I could ride a bike to every corner of town, and I did. And this was just a matter of course. And then later on in life, when I, you know, got out into the larger world and I saw the sorts of places you would have to live to have cars, that you needed to have a car to get around, it started to be sort of odd, and understood that people who live in places like that live an atomized existence. So they have to, in order to have a community, they have to get in their car and drive to a place that they have an intention to go to. It's not a place where you go to as a matter of course. It's not a city square. It's not any of that. You have to drive to these things. You have to be in there. And then what it allows you to do is to really kind of section your life off into, these are the sorts of people I want to be with. These are the sorts of people I don't want to be with. The car is a very convenient way to separate you from that, because you can just roll up your window and you don't have to deal with them. So it allows for people to be antisocial. And so you start to realize that I think a lot of America's sort of problems with antisocial, you know, thoughts, and it might not be necessarily criminal, but sort of the way we sort of interact with each other in a hostile way, really I think comes out of that. And so for me, trying to understand that people live in community as what I think is human nature to do so, I think that's incredibly affected by that. So
I think it's interesting to observe the differences between what happened in the States and what happened in Europe, because things developed a little bit different, even though the context is actually the same. Because during this century we have the car, the appearance of the car and mass transportation also. And also after World War II, especially after the Soviet Union fell, both in the States and in Europe, we have a capitalistic outlook on the world and on growth. So within this context, the European and the American city grew fast. Now the American city grew very, very fast, and much faster than the European city. And then you ask yourself why. European cities had an anchor that held them back, and this anchor is called cultural heritage. I mean, the historic center of the city is always the center of every European city, and there we have principles that have proven themselves over hundreds of years. Walkability, access to cultural events, access to commercial spaces, to public spaces, and this cultural baggage of the European city, I think, what helped it not to sprawl out of control, and it didn't go into an unlimited growth like many of the American cities, which reached exactly what you described, Erik. Situations where people live on their own and live in some kind of loneliness or antisocial environment because of distances and because of the effort that the car takes to actually reach these different centers of interest. In Israel, it's also a little different because Israel grew and it looked always up to the American standards, but it does have the cultural heritage, and Israel also lacks space. So that actually created compact cities, and when the suburbs started growing, everything is close by. I mean, the whole of Israel, you can within 6 hours in the car drive from top to bottom, 6-7 hours. So you're not far away. The distances are not so big, but it's crowded. And we feel it actually in today's cities in Israel with traffic jams, with congestions in mobility, with a lack of enough public transportation, and we're trying to fix it. Hopefully we will.
Now, Steve, you do a lot of work and are involved in the new urbanism movement, which I think might be a new word for some of our mostly probably European audience. And I know it was confusing because when we were planning this panel, I kept saying, I think we should bring some new urbanists on. They're very traditional. And they're like, wait a minute. How is a movement called new urbanism claiming to be, a traditional urbanist movement? So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining to the audience a little bit more about what is new urbanism, which is a movement that emerged in the U.S. now around 40 years ago. What are its goals and aims, and how do you see it developing?
Yeah, the new urbanism is actually, it is essentially the old urbanism, but adapted for cars. That's a quick kind of one-liner explanation, and because the fact is that even though there are some places in the U.S. that there's one called cul-de-sac that's being developed in Arizona right now, where there will be no cars in the place at all. Cul-de-sac is a strange name for it, but that's a different story. But to realistically do that, to tell most people you can no longer have a car in the U.S., that is if someone were to do that, it would be economic suicide. They become no longer economically viable because we've divided everything out into all these single-use zones, and so if you just can't do that. And so the question, so what we're doing is we're trying to say that the path between the current state of affairs in almost all of the U.S. to a very compact place where you actually can live without a car. It is not a one-step jump. You can't get there in one step. It is many steps to get you from the current state of affairs in the U.S. to what you all actually enjoy in much of Europe, quite frankly. We're great admirers of European urbanism. There's many lessons to learn. As a matter of fact, some of the early new urbanist projects, what they would do is they would take the entire design team, put them on a plane, bring them over here, and say, here's some lessons we really need to learn. And so that is kind of the quick explanation of what it's about. I mean, there's many other things as well. I will say this, and it's been very interesting because in the there is a very big divide between the new urbanism leading up to 2008, when the the meltdown happened, and then the Great Recession that followed, And then what has happened since then, up until that point, we were doing a lot of big projects, you know, at the scale of an entire town or entire neighborhood or something. Now there's been, the really interesting thing is there's been an incredible amount of innovation since '08, when the old methods didn't work anymore. You couldn't get financing at the scale of Wall Street to do new development. And it's all kinds of stuff like the Incremental Development Alliance, the missing middle housing. I mean, there are just so many things. Tactical urbanism, all these things have developed since then out of absolute necessity. Otherwise, we would have been, you know, what are you going to do if you're old? For example, I do a design review from October of '08, when the crash happened, for over 2 years after that, I did not review one single design. If I weren't writing books and doing other stuff, you know, I would have been, you know, homeless. So, but anyhow, it's some amazing stuff that's happened since that time. So the new urbanism today is very different from the new urbanism of before 2008.
And Erik, you've also worked somewhat with new urbanism. Is there anything that you see in new urbanism that makes it a particularly attractive option for you, or an option for American cities?
A lot of the new urbanism that I look at, that I work at trying to do, really is, like you said, it's the old urbanism, and it is. We look at Europe a lot, and I think Europe is a great, has absolutely the best examples and places we like to see and visit and learn lessons from. But a lot of it is the old urbanism of America. It is the old urbanism of the cities that existed before the 20th century in America, and we're really looking at that. So one of the sort of people have a misnomer about new urbanism is that it's about building what they call 4/1s or 5/1s. It's 5 stories of a wood-framed apartment building above a concrete base that has a parking deck underneath it. That's the entirety of new urbanism, is building these frankly ugly apartment buildings that don't have any relationship to a city or a town. But the new urbanism really should be about building cities the way that they were built, when people could have the option to walk to somewhere, that they didn't have to have a car. It's a place where, largely in America, because we are a little bit more spread out, that people could have a suburban house pretty easily with a yard, a garden behind, and not be right on top of each other, but not so spread out that it was impossible to get anywhere on foot. It is to make places that people relate to as being distinctly American and distinctly places that they can really love. If they want to have a car, sure, it's fine. It's not something that's completely necessary, though. I think that's really the elements, and we see it all over America. The city that I live in Richmond, Virginia, people come to that city to see the architecture, to see it, to see the neighborhoods that are walkable. But they are green, they are leafy, they are pleasant places to be. They're not a sea of concrete. It's not Manhattan. And so I try to design things to look like that and feel like that, so that people can feel comfortable doing it. You know, what's interesting is always people, generally speaking, American conservatives have a negative reaction to the words new urbanism and urbanism in general. But if you poll people, if you ask them, would you like to live in a place where you could walk to the store, to walk to your church, to walk to your school? And overwhelmingly, people say, absolutely yes. And it has nothing to do with party, has nothing to do with any of it. So we're really just trying to deliver to people the things that I think they really actually desire and want. And we see this, and we know this all the time, that they do want this, because when they get built in this way, and the older neighborhoods and the older cities in the country are always the most expensive, which means they are in the most demand. So
maybe to dwell for one more minute on this contradiction that you said, we are talking about new urbanism, but we are making reference to old urbanism. And what is this about? And I think it's about these principles that have proven themselves in the older European cities and maybe also in the older American cities before the car that we are trying to go back. And we talked a lot about walkability, which is really important, but there are other things, from small things to bigger things, that help these older principles, like how narrow or how wide the streets are planned, what's the scale, what's the proportions, do houses have a front porch, do they encourage socializing? So it's all kind of issues like this that New Urbany looks at, and I would call New Urbanism, I don't know if you will agree, but maybe the renaissance of urbanism. Like in the Renaissance, they try to go back to the classical, to the older standards of beauty that have proved themselves. That's how New Urbanism is trying to go back to principles that proved themselves in the past and bring them back and revive them. Find out why we lost control of our cities and put them back into some kind of order.
You mentioned this concept of beauty, which I think is interesting because around the same time as New Urbanism emerged, there was also the New Classicist movement in the United States, which started forming with thinkers like Leon Krier, who also would advocate for, especially going back to kind of medieval urbanism, really with Krier, but he also argued that architecture itself should look back. And you've seen, I think, many people connect New Urbanism with this New Classicist movement, that this idea of not only are we going to build cities that are, the plan is like we used to have, but we're going to build cities that look like what cities used to look like, because obviously, we can see that architecture can vary quite a bit, and in the last 100 years, we've gone from perhaps the building right there to the building to my right, which is very different in nature, and certainly take different approaches to beauty, this one ignoring it, that one being it. Do you think that, so the larger question at large is, do you think urbanism and architecture are entirely separate? And is New Urbanism inherently linked to New Classicism?
That has been a big debate since the beginning of the New Urbanism, since it was first actually congealed, about 40 years ago. Well, it was the building of it began at 40 years ago. The actual organization, the Congress for the New Urbanism, is newer than that. And Leon Krier actually did not sign the charter because he said architecture is essential, whereas there were some architects that were some of the founders that they said, no, we will not sign the charter unless you make it style agnostic. And so Krier didn't sign, but they did. But anyhow, I don't like the term beauty because we've been inoculated against beauty for like 300 years. I forget the name of the German philosopher that who first put the idea out that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But that's been such a commonly repeated refrain that I think beauty is a bit toxic as a term. The term I use instead of beauty is love. And what we've seen in buildings all over is that if it can't be loved, it won't last. If people don't love it, they'll eventually they'll find a reason to tear it down. Actually, interestingly, if you look at these two buildings here, they're both in a similar state of disrepair. The one on the left and then on the right, and you can actually from upstairs you can get a good shot of both of them side by side. The life expectancy of this building is probably centuries more than the life expectancy of this building, because all of the things that humans have been long proven to find appealing were all stripped off over here, versus they were not over here, and so I really I think that love is a far more effective term than beauty is. You don't get a debate out of anyone except an architect, and I can say that because I am one. But you don't get a debate out of anyone about if a building is lovable or not. but is it beautiful? You know, the debates are endless with that term.
Well, it's an interesting approach, and actually it puts beauty aside, and you can say you either love it or hate it. But I think it's also important to define what's beauty when it comes to an urban environment, not just architecture, because we are talking about urbanism, not just architecture. Of course, is a big part of urbanism and beauty in urbanism. But how do we define beauty? And for me, I think it has to do a lot with scale and proportions. And that's when it comes to human scale design, which looks if a city is actually fitting to the human scale. And I want to give an example. I was in Tokyo and I'm in love with the city. It's a crazy, modern and traditional and huge city, but it's not in human scale. It's a three-dimensional city. Even sometimes you navigate on Google Maps and you don't know if you should be on the bridge. That's not part of new urbanism. So you don't know if you're navigating, on which level you're navigating in Tokyo. It's out of the human scale. And then you go and you visit a city like Kyoto, and it's a very quaint city, both traditional and modern. And suddenly I walked around Kyoto and I thought to myself, this reminds me of Florence. Now you will tell me, you're crazy. How does Kyoto remind you of Florence? But it's on the scale, on the proportions of the human scale to the street scale, the height of the building to the width of the street. And I think that proportions and understanding of the proportions and the human scale really relates to beauty when it comes to urbanism.
I love all of those comments, especially the idea of love, and it makes me think of Roger Scruton's phrase about how we need beauty because it gives us a sense of being at home. And I think that's what people want more than anything else in their cities and in their neighborhoods, their house where they live, is to feel at home, that this is a place that they can be, that's surrounded by beauty, and a place that they can love. And to me, it really is the key thing to bringing urbanism back, is understanding that beauty in architecture, lovability in architecture is absolutely essential to it. We have in America, we have a term called NIMBYs, which is not in my backyard. And it's usually typified by people who live in a neighborhood and something is getting proposed to be built, and they raise an absolute stink, go to their city council members and say, you have to stop this. The reason they want to stop it is because they're used to, when a building gets torn down, its replacement is uglier and more inhumane than what was there before. And the reason that it is because architects build in a way that does not respect beauty, does not respect those things. And so it's just a matter of course that what they build is going to be worse. There was a time when we could build a building and what was knocked down, when we had the confidence that what was going to go up was going to be better. Every building that we know was at one time brand new. It's a silly thing to think about, but yeah, every single thing. And many times in many cities, there was something that was really nice there before, but now we have something even nicer, or at least equal to it. Now, the reason why architects aren't doing this is because they have been indoctrinated into modernism. Modernism is essentially, like we said, it's a revolution. It threw out everything that happened before it. It threw out centuries and centuries of traditions. And I don't know of a single other discipline in science, in construction, in engineering, that at one time took everything it knew and threw it in the trash and tried to start over again. But art and architecture did that in the 20th century. They literally took the books on the history, threw them in the courtyard, and lit them on fire. And they intentionally sneer at the past, that the things that were built before are the things that we cannot do. And it's a moralistic stance that says we live in a time that's new. And again, we go back to that idea of the new man, that we go back to Hegel and Marx. They assume that to be true, that every single human being who lives today is different than the human beings who lived in the past. Now, we as classicists understand and believe that human beings are essentially the same. They were the same as they were 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, everything. Situations have changed, engineering, science, those things have changed, but we as human beings have not. So the things that we need, the beauty that we need, the home, the sense of those things, that is still the same. And so what I think we need to do in order to change the way that things are going to happen and to build better cities, we have to go back to fundamentals and look at the way that architects are being trained and look at how they have been indoctrinated into looking at the culture, the past, the beauty of the things that are there, and want to destroy it by building things that don't respect it. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems that we have. In the United States of America, I think there's 117 schools of architecture, and there are 3 that teach classical architecture. 3. And those are always constantly under assault as well. So that to me is the issue, and so that's the way that I think that architecture could be reformed, because I think they're essential to each other.
But Erik, we don't want our audience here to think that modernism is all bad, right? Modernism has produced both some beautiful architecture, of course with other principles, but also some beautiful cities. I think Tel Aviv is one of the examples of a beautiful city that modernism produced. Tel Aviv is defined by UNESCO as a cultural heritage site. It's called the White City because it was built a lot based on the international style. The growth was after World War II, and we can see some beautiful results. We can see some beautiful city centers or some beautiful buildings, or to go to your lexicon, buildings that we love, or squares and piazzas that we love, which are on a very modernistic style. Many of the architects in Tel Aviv that built in the beginning and in the middle of the century were from the Bauhaus school, and we have a lot of good examples of international style. So what I'm saying is modernism is not all that bad. And sometimes we have to look forward. We can't only look backwards. Of course, we should take, I agree with you, we should take the principles that have proved themselves, but then redefine them looking forward and into the future.
Yeah, there's, I mentioned that I lived in South Beach for 17 years, where the predominant architecture leading up to World War II was actually Art Deco. And I can make a really strong case that Art Deco was the last living tradition to die right at the end of World War II. Whereas after that, they said, no, we cannot do anything like that again. It must be the worst thing that we as a profession have ever burdened ourselves with is what I call the necessity of uniqueness, where if you want to be significant, your work must be unique, and that's actually a big part of getting published too, because the architectural magazines, the press, they don't want to publish the same old stuff time and again. They say, no, you got to show something new, but the problem is the batting average of having to create something entirely novel that has never been seen before. The batting average is very, very poor. the Eiffel Tower was one of the ones that actually succeeded. And for a little while it was not regarded too well, but then after that it's the icon of the nation, really, in a lot of ways. And so, but if we were to allow an architecture to do what Art Deco did, where you can build out many buildings in that character of architecture in a place, and you don't have to make it unique. Uniqueness is the problem, not a fabric of an architecture that is appropriate to a place. In my opinion.
I think that idea of uniqueness, I think that's a very good one, and I do agree. I mean, there are places that are not necessarily completely traditional, and South Beach, of course, is like one of those that I think is really great. But it's the idea of humility that I think is not something that is taught in the culture of architecture and in planning. The humility to look at what is there. So if you were to go to Tel Aviv and say, well, we need to knock down half of this and build it classical, I think people would hate that too, probably. But the humility to know that what belongs in a place and what belongs in a city and how people live and how they want to live, rather than the ideas that we simply formulate in our heads, but have a humility to look at the past and say, what they did before can be looked at, it can be understood, and it can be emulated. And so we pick the things that are successful. Some of my absolute favorite architects are actually the very early 20th century architects who were working within traditional styles, but were extremely creative and very modern. Otto Wagner was the architect of so much work in Vienna. And if you go to see any of that stuff in Vienna, it is amazing what was there. Sir Edwin Lutyens in England built amazing stuff that is incredibly creative and incredibly talented and unique, but yet it also has that humility to look at what was the past and learn from it and adapt from it. I think what's happened in architecture so much in the schools, again, is that uniqueness is the number one goal. Deference and humility is the last thing that they try to teach. So we don't get that idea that we're creating for others, but we're creating for our own self and our own glory and our own hubris.
I'm glad to see there's a little bit of debate here. I always enjoy moderating a panel where everyone doesn't agree with each other. Ones where everyone agrees with each other are quite boring, I tend to find. Now, for you, Rebeka, in your particular background, you focus a lot on lighting. How does light, and I think light's one of those things that perhaps we don't notice it until it's not there, right? So could you go in a little bit and explain kind of your research and looking into lighting and how you see that playing a role in successful urbanism?
Actually, it's true what you say, that as a lighting designer, I always say when I do a good job, nobody notices, but if I do a bad job, everybody notices that the lighting is not good. So it's a real challenge, actually. It's not like architecture that you see it in your face and you say, wow, great job. If the lighting is good, it's not glary, nobody will complain, so you did a good job. Regarding urban lighting, I'm glad you're bringing it up, Stephen, because I think it's an important part of urbanism, our night scenario. What happens during the night in the cities? And we plan and build our built environments to fit our needs. We want to be safe, we want to be in our comfort zone, and we want to be protected from the elements. And that's what we do when we plan lighting. We actually want visual comfort, we want to navigate through the city in the night, and we want to be safe. We don't want to get mugged. So historically, that's how lighting planning started, with safety and visual comfort. But if we look at the cities today during the night, we see that lighting, that's not the only thing that does. It's not only there to give us safety and visual comfort, and when it does do only that, then it's quite mundane, quite boring, quite technical, I would say. So actually, as lighting planners, we want to enrich the experience of the city during the night, and it's like painting a painting. You put layers and layers of color and you accentuate different things, and that's what you do with lighting. Like if we look at the city during the night, I could maybe classify the lighting layers in 5 types. You can say that you have the street lighting, which we just talked about, and we have facade lighting that comes from the buildings or on our buildings. We have monumental lighting that comes to accentuate our cultural heritage, and it gives little accents here and there, and it gives us a sense of identity and place. We have landscape lighting, which comes to accentuate all the green areas, and hardscape lighting, which is integrated in all the pedestrian areas. So for us to have a great experience during the night, these layers need to be balanced. But what happened in the last 50 years, actually these layers are not in balance, and we have issues of light pollution and glare. We have too much light during the night that messes up with our circadian rhythm. We have energy imbalance and waste. So we need to take the pendulum back and bring things back into balance. And when we are talking about lighting planning, urban lighting planning, we are talking about adaptive planning, dynamic lighting, that actually changes depending on the situation within the city, that, for example, has motion sensors and knows if a public space is occupied or not. Even maybe astronomical clocks, which already exist, but maybe also clocks that work with the lunar schedule, that can add the amount of light that we need and not overlight our city. And of course, there are also decorative aspects that we can add in lighting, like color today, and we can have lighting that engages people, that reacts to people's presence and to their movement, and colored lighting that can maybe give the city a more festive look on certain occasions. So this is lighting that aims for a more resilient city, a more adaptive city for the future.
That sounds fascinating. Steve or Erik, how do you see lighting playing a role, and perhaps how does lighting play a role in new urbanism, if it does at all?
You know, there was a conference 4 or 5 years ago when there was a lighting expert that came and spoke to the conference, and then she said, "Let me take you out this evening, and we'll do a walking tour with my light meter." And I would never have believed this, but she set her meter down like over here, and it was like 4-foot candles. She set it down over there. She said, "Is this brighter or dimmer?" And everybody said, "Well, it looks about the same." And it was 40-foot candles. The point is that the human eye is so good that it can adapt to the setting so much that it was an order of magnitude. I never would have believed that until we actually saw it happening. Anyhow, that created a greater degree of appreciation for what you do, never having met you until now, but from that experience with her.
When I was in college at Notre Dame, they had placed streetlights all over the campus, and they made them so bright white that it actually was dark. It was too dark because the eye adjusts to it. So basically the iris contracts, and now everything that's not the light is completely black. So it was actually it was very difficult. So that's one of those things, the elements that you really have to pay attention to. And I was just going to say, you mentioned like protection from the elements, and I was thinking about today. My family heritage is from Holland. We're not used to having sun, so any place that has shade, has trees or buildings that have a decent height to them, those are things too that I think really make places to be comfortable. So we want to have them, but not in such a way that it's overwhelming, and a lot of times you go to places like New York City, it's dark. It's far too dark because the buildings are out of scale with it and it blocks the sun. So that's kind of some of the thoughts I have on that.
All right, so as we close, I would like to ask each of you, as a closing kind of question, you can sum up maybe your general views with it as well. Where do you hope to see urbanism going as we enter the mid part of the 21st century? What are some of the principles that you would like to see become mainstream, become something that most cities implement in their planning? What would you like to see? Rebeka, we can start with you.
So I want to start with the biggest challenge that I see with new urbanism, and that is the gentrification that comes with urban renewal. The moment that urban renewal starts in an area of the city, there are whole communities that get displaced. The rent goes up, the property values go up, which is a good thing if you own property, but then you have whole populations that are weaker economically being displaced. And I think this is the main challenge, one of the main challenges today of the new urbanism. And the way to address it probably is policy, together with planning, but policy and protecting such populations from rising rents or displacement need to be considered.
I'd say that the thing that I want to have the most is to have, like, going back to the beginning, is building cities and towns that are lovable and are loved by the people who live there, not just used by them, to create places that are humane in both their character, but also in the way that people are able to live there and not be injured and killed. One of the things I'm very interested in and always is traffic safety as part of urbanism, and the fact that we build everything around cars in America, and 40,000 people a year in our country die in car-related accidents. Almost 10,000 people as walking were hit by cars and killed in a year. And it's one of those things that I think bringing traditional urbanism together and creating places that people love, that they can walk and be around, that they don't that they're safe in their cities. And I think that's going to be one of the things that I think really is pushing me to try and create places that have the principles of the new urbanism as a matter of passion for me. So,
as you might guess, well, I actually have two big goals. One goal, as you might guess, is to get better at building places people love. We've heard that already. But the other thing is, an urban plan is something that gets designed and drawn up and then gets put on the shelf and collects dust. That's what normally happens with an urban plan. If, however, what you can do is do it that actually is a business plan, not just an urban plan. In other words, it has design, but it also has a way that people can thrive in the place, then that becomes something that actually people will act upon that. And I've got a very strange story to tell you here in the next minute and 5 seconds. And that is, it was a place that we did years ago near Montgomery, Alabama, that all around they were selling land they were selling 2-acre lots for $40,000. So the developed value was $20,000 per acre. Immediately, as soon as people got the picture of what we were doing, then within the place, it was selling for $500,000 an acre, 25 times as much. But because we were looking to have a ratio of 15 to 1 in terms of the most expensive to least expensive, we had some one-bedroom cottages that were selling for $160,000. That price had not even been heard of in the area in terms of affordability in many, many years. So I think if we can do, we actually can have both, but it has to be a plan for how can people thrive there. And I finished 11 seconds early.
Perfect timing. I want to have you. I hope you guys will join me in thanking our guest. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did. That was a fascinating panel with some interesting debates. And I'm sure if any of you guys have questions or comments, I'm sure our panelists would be happy to answer them after it. Thank you guys so much for coming.